Welcome back to Charlotte's Guide to Identifying Historical Fashion, 1880 to 1900 edition. Some might say this is a pretty broad overview for two very different decades, but remember we're doing the broadest overview of the 19th century. We started off with the early silhouettes, which were very narrow. We looked at the wide silhouettes of the middle of the century, and now we're back to a more narrow silhouette. Keeping in mind the most authentic ways of looking at historical fashion to give the most accurate representations possible are always going to be fashion plates, which are magazine and authentic images from the time periods, paintings of particularly notable people because they would have been wearing their most fashionable garments from the time period. Of course, later in the 19th century, you get the added benefit of photography, which is going to show you exactly what women were wearing, not just interpretations. And of course, my favorite, the actual dresses in museums. This is going to be the most authentic look at what women were wearing and not just interpretations like you might see in a TV show. What were the most defining features of these two decades? Well, I would argue that the bustle is the most defining feature of the 1880s. So if you see something that has a bustle, chances are it's going to be around the 1880s. And if you see something with puffed sleeves, it's a dead ringer for the 1890s. And obviously they're not called balloon sleeves, they're actually called leg of mutton sleeves, but for visual purposes, you want bustles and balloons. You might notice in my other videos, we stopped at the 1860s and then we went straight to the 1880s. That's because, as I said in my earlier videos, I consider the 1830s and the 1870s to be transitional periods because you do see bustles in the 1870s, but I really think that they connect the wide skirts of the 1860s to the bustles of the 80s. So we're going to do those in a different video. Like I said, if you see something with a bustle, it's going to be pretty close to the 1880s, so you know you're not looking at like an 1830s or 20s dress. Again, here are some more examples of dresses with these giant, huge puffy sleeves. And even though there is some flair going on with the trumpety type skirts, they are still pretty narrow compared to the 1860s and 50s, which is when skirts reached their absolute maximum, and they don't really ever get that wide ever again. I like to include popular TV and clothing references that people might recognize. Now I know that the Gilded Age does take creative liberties with their fashion, but they do get the silhouettes pretty right. So they've got a lot of bustle situation going on here, which is a great example of a contemporary take on 1880s fashion. And then I forget what the name of this TV show is, but this is a phenomenal example of large balloon 1890s sleeves while still having that structured silhouette. I do know there is a little bit of crossover at the turn of the century, but you know which side of the century you're on if you can see a structured corset versus one of those blousy pigeon breast bodices. Kind of like this would be more of a turn of the century example, but I like to bring up Anne with an E because everybody likes to talk about how she loved her puff sleeves, which is an indicator that the story was taking place around the 1890s. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you feel equipped to identify late 19th century fashion.